Hey friends, Pastor Kim here. 66 books in 66 days, and today we are in 2 Timothy, Paul's second letter to young Timothy. Now, if you remember from yesterday, Paul wrote this first letter to Timothy to give him encouragement and to instruct him as a leader. Instructions on right belief, instructions about the church, instructions for elders. And when you get to the second letter that Paul writes to Timothy, you find that it's giving final instructions as Timothy becomes the pastor of the church in Ephesus. I like to look at this as a pastor coming out of licensing school and receiving their first appointment. If you're familiar with how the United Methodist Church works, you go to licensing school, get your credentials, and then you serve as a licensed local pastor. And so maybe this is where Paul was leading Timothy, and Timothy was receiving those credentials, and now he was being given the marching orders to go and to serve the church in Ephesus. And so this book is broken out into two main sections, chapters 1 and 2, foundations of Christian service, which is important for leading a church, and then difficult times in Christian service, important for the time of persecution that the young churches were going through during that time. So Paul is giving helpful advice to Timothy to remain solid and grounded in Christian service and to endure the suffering during the difficult days that were to come. One thing that we need to know about this is considered Paul's last letter before he would be martyred as he was in Rome, written sometime around AD 64 to 67, give or take a few dates there. He's writing from prison in Rome. After a year or two of freedom, Paul was arrested again and then was executed under Emperor Nero. And Paul knew that his life was coming to an end, and he wanted to give this final last bit of instruction to his young leader, Timothy. And so this is a very personal letter, a very powerful letter for Timothy to receive. If you could imagine having a leader, a mentor like Paul, who is being put to death for his faith. As a young leader in the church, you would know that difficult times would come for you. And he was probably feeling some timidity in his spirit because this was a fearful time. And so the themes that rise up out of 2 Timothy, this very powerful last letter of Paul's, is the call to be bold, to be faithful, to preach and to teach the honest gospel of Jesus Christ. The key verse that comes out of 2 Timothy is from chapter 2, verse 15. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a workman who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly handles the word of truth. I think that's a good text for us to hold near and dear to our spiritual selves, because we need to be knowing that we need to present ourselves. Because when we are presenting ourselves as leaders of the church, we are representing Jesus Christ. Never to be ashamed, but to lean into what is correct, what is the correct truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so this letter really begins with an encouragement for Timothy to be faithful, with these little phrases that show up in verses 3 through 12. I'm going to remember you in my prayer. For this reason, I remind you to fan into the flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. So, Paul blessed Timothy, anointed him for the work ahead, calling him to have and to live a holy life, and to not be ashamed. And knowing that Paul was convinced that Timothy was able to guard what had been entrusted to him for the days that were coming. The hope was to reach receptive hearts, and how to step out with the gospel in order to touch hearts that were ready and willing to receive the truth of God. And this is really about the truth of God's word, the truth of the living word, who is Christ. And Paul telling him that no matter what happens, the truth of Christ, the living word, must continue to be proclaimed despite opposition, because it is the truth that will reach the hearts of those who are seeking. And it's hard for us to know until we get to know someone who is seeking a relationship with Christ or who is not. And so we need to represent in the best way we can. We need to be the kind of person that can be used for noble purposes. And that is what Paul is talking about when he goes into the latter half of chapter 2, calling Timothy to be a workman approved by God. Totally doing the work approved by God. Verse 16 of chapter 2, avoid godless chatter, because those who indulge in it will become more and more ungodly. Their teaching will spread like gangrene. And then he gives some examples of those that were not living under the truth and teaching the truth as the truth needed to be taught. And then Paul gives this charge to Timothy at the latter part of chapter 3, beginning in verse 10. You, however, know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, faith, patience, love, endurance, persecutions, sufferings, what kinds of things happened to me in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra. He knew this because he was traveling with him. The persecutions I endured. Yet the Lord rescued me from all of them. In fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. That's something that's hard for us to read, but if we think about it, if we are truly authentically giving our life to Jesus, we will face some persecution. And so when you get into chapter 4 talks about these difficult times a little more, and one of the key verses for me comes chapter 4, verse 2. Preach the word, be prepared in season and out of season, correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction, for the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. Have you ever been annoyed by an itching ear? Sometimes when we're hearing things that we know are not right, and we need to choose. We need to know what is right and what is not right. So it's the idea of being prepared in season and out of season means to always be ready to serve God in any given situation, whether or not it is convenient, and that we need to be sensitive to the opportunities that God has given us. And so these are some really good instructions that Paul is giving. I encourage you to read this because it is considered by most scholars Paul's last letter ever written before he was martyred. He was beheaded. A lot of people think that he was beheaded for his faith. And when I think of this being his last letter, I think this letter has a whole lot more meaning to it, because he was emphasizing the importance, especially to the church in Ephesus, that this church needed to keep its first love and stay strong and faithful, and needed to have a leader like Timothy to step in at just the right moment. And so, where does God call you to step in at just the right moment to represent him? I leave you with that for now, friends. Take care, stay safe, stay well, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.